let's talk about cheap junk units in Warhammer 40k and why they're pretty awesome to have in your army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k gameplay and list building. And for this one I thought we'd focus on the cheapest and least assuming units in the army list and all the excellent value that you can get out of a very few points invested to help you win games overall while most of your army is doing the serious business of dueling with and trying to destroy the enemy. For this one I really wanted to focus on some of the absolute cheapest units out there in Warhammer 40k, and perhaps an underrated class of models by newer players. I feel like when I get asked advice on army lists, one of the biggest criticisms I often have is not having enough small units for utility and objective purposes, because people don't quite grasp what they can do, why they're good, and how units can be strong in game without necessarily being big damage and defense units. For this one I thought we'd focus on units that are often the very cheapest choices in their codexes, maybe even cheaper than the average utility unit out there. Talk through the value and options that you can use with them when putting them on the tabletop, and then run through perhaps a top 6 of some of the ones I'd consider the very best. First up, literally every unit in Warhammer 40k has pretty even power in terms of board control, at least until the opponent can actually destroy them, whether it's a great big battle tank or a single base of rippers. When enemies are moving around they can't go within 1 inch of them, and you can't typically deep strike within 9 inches of them, so even a single model base could potentially deny deep strike to really quite a large area and force the opponent's reserves to come in somewhere else, ideally not threatening your objectives or your most valuable units. It means that cheap low investment units that don't have a high points cost are pretty excellent to have as a sort of second wave in the back of the home field. Say things like lone Crutox riders, individual locust destroyers, or a few swarms or something. It might mean that if you place them as sort of the next unit along for, say, the ones that are guarding your home field objective, it might mean that the opponent can't arrive reserves to threaten your most important units and deal damage, and can't easily drop to threaten the home objective or do certain secondaries like behind enemy lines. It can be handy to have a super cheap unit or two, just to sort of fill in gaps and be a placeholder model, given that the vast majority of your army is going to be stomping up the board. Potentially this can be done by really low defense units if they're hiding out of line of sight, potentially even lone characters that it might make sense to have on the board for another reason, like a Death Guard Tallyman, and it's quite often to see lone operatives also used in this role, typically a little bit more expensive, but having a nice bonus in the home field and the opponent's likely to be quite a long way away from them, so it isn't going to be able to get within 12 inches to shoot them. It can certainly pay to have these expendable units screening the most important in your army in the backfield, but also can make sense to have them pushing forward as the first rank as well. Typically in games of Warhammer 40k you are going to have to move up and engage with the enemy, otherwise they're going to jump on the objective, score all the points, and probably going to make themselves problematic to counter-attack. It means that you're going to need some units on the front line, and usually it makes sense to have them to be at least relatively low investment ones early in the game, as they're going to be the ones that take the first strike and the first damage. If the opponent has to move out to deal with them and then winds up using a more valuable unit to charge down your cheap chaff, you can then counter-attack them in turn. It's also quite nice for units that are going to be exposed and you don't mind about dying too much. Like say again if you really want to push back enemy reserves and deep strikers or strategic reserves. Perhaps for example if you had some scarab swarms going up the edges of the board for the Necrons, you might buy yourself a turn where enemy strategic reserves have to basically come in their own deployment zone or near enough, making them far less useful. I feel like for these style units there's bonus points if they can infiltrate, scout, or at least fairly durable, so the opponents actually are forced to commit some genuine damage outputs to clearing them out, rather than just being able to remove them effortlessly with a small chaff unit of their own. While units are on the front lines, if they're not dealt with early, or you have them very far up the board with scout or infiltrate or something, they could potentially keep enemy units out of the fight if it made sense. Monsters and vehicles maybe being the easiest ones to do that, given that they're going to be already pretty limited by having to go around terrain, and if they have to stay 1 inches away from your models in the movement phase as well, that might mean that you can block entire movement corridors for them and stop them getting anywhere near objectives, or maybe taking up good lines of sight to shoot your important stuff. Maybe things like Nurglings or fast moving expendable units could be good with that. Say for example some Nurglings movement blocking a couple of Knight Armigers trying to pass through some ruins. Finally, for sort of board control and shutting down enemy units, another way in which you can tie the enemy up, stop their damage, and stop their units getting where they need to be is to nuisance charge them. You need to do that with something that's adequately tough, that's not just going to get wiped out by the unit that it was trying to hold up, but this can seriously disrupt the enemy, stop their damage output, or stop that damage output going where it really needs to. Expendable chaff units do tend to be a pretty great option for that. If the enemy is an infantry unit, you can tie up their shooting, and even if they're a vehicle, it means they can't move and then fire, so if they need to move to get line of sight, they're not going to be able to. For particularly durable units, you might be able to tie them up long enough so they can't charge something that you actually care about, and it can be a way to move block, as mentioned before. If, say, the Nurglings charge the Knight Armiger, there's a pretty reasonable chance that at least one base of them survives, and that extra charge movement might have been what they needed to actually be able to get in their way, as opposed to being too far away to do that. It might also be the difference between charging onto objectives to take them. Depending on the unit, you might even get a little bit of damage as a bonus, though given the units that are mainly focusing on here, that's likely going to be a small positive as opposed to the main event. Next up, before we get on to what they can do on objectives, I'll perhaps appropriately enough talk about today's video sponsor in ObjectiveMarkers.com, a UK-based maker of faction-specific objective markers that can now post to Australia and Europe, as well as the UK and USA. Their main offering are these things: faction-specific objective markers where you have a central disc in the middle and then a scoring zone measured out to 3 inches, so you can basically really clearly see which models are on an objective and which ones aren't. Quite common accessories for playing Warhammer 40K. Their takes on them do feel quite nice, adding a bit of subtle faction theming, but also being made of clear flexible silicone so you can actually see the gaming surface that you're playing on, and they don't detract from the battlefield too much. They've got really quite a lot of designs of these, including an Auspex one that I'll certainly approve of on this channel. That's a nice generic tactical feeling one. But beyond that, they've got a whole range good for plenty of factions: Golden Guardians, Power Armoured Warriors or Space Swarms, a Chaos design, a green skin one, and some Xenos tech. As part of their launch promotions, they're shipping out some dice with each order at no extra cost, which might be of interest to some of you. And they do have a few other things on their website, such as these Ruined Terrain bases. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. You can find them linked down in the video description. Talking of objectives though, the cheapest units around are often good to help out both with primary objectives and secondaries. Maybe the most obvious one for primaries is that if you can hold an objective for the least amount of points possible, that's generally a good idea. Perhaps particularly the home field one, as it just makes sense that they'll be able to sit around safe behind a ruin, and then the rest of your army can go and play the damage and defensive game with the enemy. Lots of armies might have special rules that can help out with doing that, such as the sticky objectives rule, though if you have a faction without that, it just makes sense to take one of the cheapest things possible. I'd say some Sisters of Silence Prosecutors for the Adeptus Custodes. In the midboard, cheap units that have a little bit of objective control could be used to sweep over and steal an objective for a turn as well. A fair few enemy elite damage dealers aren't going to have a vast amount of OC, and unless they've got something to deter you from just running straight up to an objective, like perhaps Overwatch or something, you might just literally be able to zoom a swarm onto the midboard and deny your opponent a bunch of victory points. Maybe a good example of that could be Tyranid Hormagaunts, pretty fast moving and able to advance and charge if they need to, lots of OC. They'll at least take some volume fire to clear, but maybe not the end of the world if you lose the unit outright. They could be part of one of the early waves of the game, jumping onto an objective to deny it, and maybe even doing a nuisance charge in the process to hold up a valuable unit. In a similar sort of vein, they could also be used to force some bad trades for the opponent. All the cheap units that have kind of bad damage but good OC could be good for that. Say for example Chaos Cultists with 10 OC for 50 points. It could just be quite nice to have a squad just point itself at an objective early in the game and line up and march towards that and just make it so the opponent actually needs to deal with them, otherwise you're going to start scoring victory points. And perhaps for certain armies that have more melee damage than range damage, you might even be able to bait charges with more valuable units and hopefully put them in a position where they're going to get hit back hard. Maybe if the cultists move up to this primary objective, then the Space Marine player counters by sending in a squad of jump intercessors to wipe them out and take that point once again. Hopefully that unit's now in a good position where you can hit them back convincingly, and after that interaction you've lost a 50-point squad of cultists and they've lost a 90-point squad of jump intercessors. Perhaps even more than primary objectives, these cheap units tend to be great for doing secondaries though. I'd certainly say that's one of the single most important draws to including some small units in any army list. In particular, the action secondaries are a really big part of that. It would need to be a tiny unit with at least some OC, so OC 1 or more. But then beyond that, if you're in the right position to do an action and survive while doing it, it doesn't matter whether it's one of your most elite damage dealers doing the action or a super cheap expendable thing that you don't care about. If you're going to have any one unit's time wasted by it, it might as well be the cheap unit that wasn't going to do anything else meaningful anyway. For armies that tend to go a bit heavy on the elite damage dealers, say if you had an army that was made up of almost entirely big battle tanks with big guns, every time you wanted to do an action like say cleanse the midboard objectives, you basically make it so you've got one of your battle tanks not shooting, so adding in some tiny units could be really big value there, even if it means that you have one less battle tank on the board. Even for the expendable units that don't have any OC, they've still got secondary objectives they can do though. They could contribute to doing behind enemy lines, engage on all fronts, establish locus or display of might. and given that units with Ash and the OC tend to be super cheap and efficient, they can be pretty excellent for doing that kind of thing, and particularly if they're getting extra value in some way like doing a bit of screening or move blocking. In general though, for the cheap units that are good at secondary objectives, they've definitely got some desirable things to have on the datasheet. Deep Strike's pretty excellent, though potentially for cheap things you could use strategic reserves as well. Scout or Infiltrate will likely get them in better positions to do things that the rest of your army can't. Ones with fast movement can be quite nice to get where they need to be, and ideally at least one OC could be kind of handy, though as mentioned you'll still have some options otherwise depending on the cards that you draw. This perhaps feels like it's become just a little bit more of a thing with the pressure of extra challenger missions to do, often sort of small secondary objectives but could easily net you 3 victory points, and quite often needing to be in action. For all this good stuff for expendable units, there's definitely other ways you could go though. I've mainly been focusing on the lowest investment things around, though I feel like in 40k at the moment, quite a lot of factions have their cheapest utility units balanced around sort of mid-investment units, maybe around about the 65 to 80 point sort of mark. I feel like in Games Workshop's game design they often want utility units to also have the power to do other interesting things on the board, which isn't the worst idea. Maybe keeps things a bit more interesting other than guys just being literally there just to be units and nothing else. Maybe things like Space Marine Intercessors with their sticky objectives and anti-horde shooting, Tau Vespid with their return to reserves and some alright neutron blaster shots when they need it, or maybe the Space Marine Combi Lieutenant with his lone operative and fairly godly movement shenanigans. A lot of these mainly feel like utility units plus, not really all that much more expensive than the very cheapest things around, but for the extra points that you pay it's probably overall worth it, even if it might distract a bit from the sheer efficiency and how expendable they are. Potentially another and slightly overlooked source of these cheap units can be character datasheets as well. Most of the 40k leader ones generally don't make too much sense unless they're actually leading a unit and getting their buffs. Obviously it's a bit more common to use lone operatives if there's a good one for this sort of thing, but you might be able to get lone characters that kind of make sense just to go on their own and then can do a bit of the small unit thing and also have some extra utility. Perhaps tends to be a bit of a niche tactic, but I've certainly seen people use this with all sorts of things. Say a cheap Space Marine Phobos Lieutenant being a very cheap deep striker that can still do a secondary objective, an Astra Militarum Commissar who could strategic reserve and again just be a single model for very cheap, a Death Guard Taliban who could camp in the home field and do some screening there as well as rustle up command points, or perhaps Deathwatch Captain Artemis with his Revive on Death. The Revive on Death rule is really quite a helpful one for this kind of role, as it means that while their defense might be puny, they can just get back up and at least have one more turn worth of utility. They almost all have very bad defense for the cost and might not have enough OC to contest primaries properly, but one OC is all that you take to do secondaries. The small bases can also be handy if they're being used for secondary objectives as well, say trying to hide behind ruins, arrive from deep strike or strategic reserve. Potentially you could have that Phobos Lieutenant drop into some very small gaps. Again, I rate these as a bit more niche compared with lone operatives though, say the Kalatas Assassin often having this role. For a good ratio of these within an army, you don't usually want to go too wild with the cheap expendable units that aren't likely to do anything much for the damage and defense game. Otherwise you perhaps might start to risk losing a bit too hard on that front, maybe not be able to keep your army from being tabled in the full 5 turns. I feel like for a fair few armies they often tend to go somewhere in the region of around 100 to 300 points or so in a 2000 point list dedicated to these expendable units. That might be a bit of a sweet spot, but you certainly can make higher numbers work depending on the army, maybe armies like Chaos Cult or Imperial Agents Imperialis fleets, both using a lot of expendable chaff that's not likely to do much damage, but generally needs a really good understanding of the Warhammer movement phase and feels like playing on hard mode. Just to look at some cheap units from a couple of random tournament lists recently, here's an Eldari list that won the Nova Open. This one's got a nice cheap expendable unit of Rangers to infiltrate, and then 3 units of Corsair Void Weavers. They've got some OKOC and a little bit of damage, and could be used to be expendable trading units going for the mid-board potentially. The Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders can also do some pretty great utility things, though are a bit higher investment and can also pair with a bit of damage. For this post-update Death Guard list, there's 3 units of Poxwalkers and 2 units of Chaos Spawn, plus a lone Taliban to camp in the backfield. Really quite a lot of units for screening, scoring, and making good use of contagions there. And seemingly there's another one from Derek Apshey of 40k Dirtbags. He's got some of the best examples of Chaos Cult lists around. Here's one from the Las Vegas Open earlier in the year that does really lean into huge amounts of screening chaff going forward. No less than 10 units of fairly low damage traitor guardsmen and cultists, plus Nurglings, Demonettes and Cypher, and could be pretty horrendous from the ball control and scoring a huge amount of victory points kind of front. Most lists that go far lower on the chaff units than this though. Before talking through just a few examples of some of the best chaff units around, as mentioned for this one I wanted to focus on maybe some of the really low points cost units. Loads of armies have some great stuff in the sort of auto-include kind of status that's just a tiny bit higher than that. I would say that most of these have some sort of additional value and are just a tiny bit less expendable as a result. Drukhari Mandrakes returning to reserves. or Guard Scout Sentinels marking targets for rerolls, but I feel like all of these would fit into the category and are all absolutely excellent and pretty good examples of units that can do all the tricks between board control, primary and secondary objectives at much lower investment than many of the damage dealers out there. Just for a few of the very best examples out there in 40k though, you couldn't really not mention Gretchen here. Only 40 points for 11 models, very easy to kill though a little bit less so in the war. It's just kind of surprising to get 21 OC for 40 points and 11 models for that points cost, making them pretty excellent screening units for guarding the home field to start with. Reasonable enough just to have a unit march up to the mid board to force the opponent to have to deal with it, maybe behind terrain if possible, and they go from fairly strong value to absolutely stand out because they have their command point farming rule. Having a chance to generate a command point for each unit or an objective, it puts them in kind of ridiculous auto-include status for the orcs, basically guaranteed that every competitive list usually takes one. I feel like 2 or 3 is also pretty reasonable. Another absolutely godly unit of these is the Biovore. It can already be a 50-point screening model for the backfield just in itself, never mind the spore mines it generates, but basically it's already a nice screening unit that essentially creates 5 more little screening units over the course of the game, raining down nuisance spore mines on the enemy that could potentially do some of the objectives that don't need OC, maybe screen some deep strike or reserves, and potentially even get in the way of enemy advances, given that the spore mine special rule prevents advances near them. Again, utterly auto-include to have just one in each Tyranid army list right now. Next up, there's the Nurglings. 40 points for literally any unit with Infiltrate is already a good deal. They can stop enemy Infiltrators deploying where they want to, and stop scout moves by screening them off, and again potentially be in position for some early game secondaries that they might be able to do despite OC 0. They do at least need a little small arms fire to take down as well with a 5+ invulnerable save. There's perhaps bonus points that they can be a small deep striking unit as well if that makes more sense in the matchup, and do have a debuff rule that can affect enemies in engagement range too, which occasionally could come into play. I feel like with 3 models they could be quite a good unit for doing move blocking and nuisance charges if the opponent doesn't deal with them too. Next up for the Chaos Marines, there's the Cultist Mob, which feels like a unit that almost defines this sort of class of units. 10 models with OCE 1, just a tiny little bit of damage they could make a bit better with Dark Pacts, but mainly there just to be a unit that can hold down objectives, and certainly great for holding the home field having a copy of the Sticky Objectives rule, which makes them a steal for 50 points. And then finally for units that feel particularly stand out for 50 points or less, the Zangor Enlightened of the Thousand Suns are just pretty awesome for a unit that moves fast, can do utility things, and have a helpful reactive move to help keep them safe as well. Never mind the fact that they've got kind of weirdly good damage with some long range anti-Space Marine style shooting with ignores cover, easily buffed with many things in the Thousand Suns army. With the asymmetric unit costing though, I feel like for the extra 30 points there's a big draw to add the extra 3 into the squad, even if it makes the overall unit less expendable. They're just very good for the stats, and enormously so for 10 points per model effectively for the next 3. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on these expendable swarms, chaff and grunts of Warhammer 40k, and which of them make the cut in your army list if any. I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below as always. That's about it for this one. As mentioned, a big thank you to ObjectiveMarkers.com for sponsoring this one. Feel free to check out their faction-specific Clear Silicon objective markers linked down in the video description. As mentioned, they've got some fun faction-themed ones for a whole bunch of 40k factions, some new Auspex ones, and they're now shipping out to Europe and Australia, as well as the UK and USA. That's it for this one. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.